Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger, and I didn't have a specific topic in mind for this podcast other than just to share my adventure in pulling things out of storage. As you remember, last week I told you that I pulled everything out of my storage unit that has been in there for years. And the storage company said that I needed to come check the storage unit anyways because there was a lot of flooding there in Kingwood. So I was expecting the worst. I was expecting to have lost thousands of dollars worth of expensive gear and furniture and all sorts of stuff. But when I got there, it actually wasn't that bad. I think I had a few inches of standing water in the storage unit that went back a few feet. So there was things in there that got ruined that I didn't want anyways, like a mattress and a box spring and things like that. So that wasn't a loss, but I had stacked all the expensive stuff up a few feet off the ground. So my speakers were good, my microphone preamps were good. Everything that I needed was okay. Thank God. So one of the things that was stacked on the floor was my massive TV. It's 70 inches or 75 inch TV, and it had a few inches of water go into the screen. It was basically sitting there in the standing. The TV was on its side, so a big rectangle sitting on its side. So the screen, part of the screen that was on the ground had, I would say, 4 or 5 inches at least of water just soaking into the screen on that edge. So of course it had water damage. It guaranteed to have water damage. So I did the smoke test. I turned it on in the garage in a safe location to where if I got the, infamous blue smoke of failed electronics, that it wouldn't start a fire or I wasn't in any danger or anything like that. I turned it on, the screen turned on. The TV functioned almost perfectly other than the obvious water damage on the right side of the screen. It had kind of inky blotches where the water had seeped in between the panels of glass and the liquid crystal display. So obvious water damage, and I scoured the internet to see if it's even possible to fix something like this, and basically what I came away with is to let it dry, just to keep letting it dry, let it dry, let it dry. The situation will either stay the same or it might improve. And what's happened is every single day I turn on that TV, it has less and less spots on it. The problem is improving just by being in a climate-controlled house, having air movement and airflow. Those bright splotches are going away every single day. So even the TV that was under a few inches of water wound up being okay. Very lucky. That TV is in a ridiculous, maybe I'll put it as the thumbnail for this podcast, but that TV is absolutely ridiculous in my setup. I don't know how permanent it's going to be. If I'm honest with myself, it probably is going to be permanent, but it is a massive, massive TV, and I'm using that as my computer monitor. Having a big TV is nice for working on audio projects or video editing because it's a nice big screen. You can have every single one of your parameters in Windows open on the screen. I'm debating whether or not to go to dual monitor or not. I probably will. Right now, currently, it's not going to be pictured in the thumbnail, but I have I think it's like a 20-inch CRT, 20-inch tube TV, just a tube TV with an S-video input and a composite input so that I can plug in my vintage video game systems and vintage computers into that instead of the big, huge TV. Because when you're playing retro games and using a retro computer, you want to have the full experience and plug it into an actual retro TV. Just a big, or not big, but a big square box glass TV. You know what I'm talking about. Just the old TVs that are still at your grandma's house. But I've got one. Again, it's not pictured in the thumbnail, but it's between my two studio monitor speakers. And that's what I can hook up my vintage computers and video games to. So I'm all set up there. I'm still pulling my freaking hair out with my audio setup, though. I have basically what it is I have it's called a Project Mix IO. It's from mid 2000s. It was made by M Audio, has long since been discontinued and abandoned by M Audio. There's no new drivers. The most recent driver for it is from Windows 7 64-bit. So it is mostly working okay, but it has been a nightmare as far as I won't get too detailed with this, but I can't get the optical inputs to work. So it has ADAT in and out for 8 channels of audio, and that's how I hook up my nice microphone preamp. My Universal Audio 4710D has 4 channels of tube and solid state blendable microphone inputs, and 4 more line inputs for a total of 8 channels on that interface, and it goes out through light pipe, through ADAT or Toslink, whatever you want to call it, and goes into the Project Mix IO, pure digital, and then out of the Project Mix IO, pure digital through FireWire into my PC, so that when I record the microphone preamps, it is unaltered by anything else in the signal chain. The only thing analog in that signal chain is the actual microphone cable plugged into that microphone preamp. Everything after that is pure digital. So that when I select it, the clock to, or the resolution, same thing, to 96K 24-bit, I know that it's going to be the pure sound of the tubes in the mic pre. It's not going to get colored by anything else. There's no other cables, no other copper involved. It is all just laser beams and electricity going right into the computer, digital. So it's pure and pristine. That's what my mic pre sound like. Is it going to add a lot of color to run it through a line input on a different interface and go out through USB? No, not really. But honestly, what I'm getting at is I'm tearing my hair out with this Project Mix IO because I cannot get the light pipe, the ADAT, the Toslink inputs to see the signal. It used to see the signal just fine and give me all those extra inputs, but it's not seeing it. So I think I'm going to have to take the Project Mix just apart, and I'm going to give it a good, deep, thorough cleaning. I'm going to clean the optical ports on not only the Project Mix, but also on the 710D, the Universal Audio, and just clean the signal chain as much as possible and see how that goes. If that doesn't work, I'll bust out my Tascam 1641, which is also a discontinued product, and I'll use some line inputs on there to get my microphone pre signal into the computer. My mic pre does not have any sort of USB output or FireWire output or anything like that, or USB Type-C, nothing like that. It's a microphone preamp, but it also has word clock and digital outputs and stuff like that, but it's not an actual audio interface. You need to hook it up into an audio interface to have it to work. So, blah, blah, blah. I am going to possibly tonight, if I can't clean up the Project Mix good enough. Also, the other thing with the Project Mix is I can't get it to work with Cakewalk Sonar. I can't get it to work with Pro Tools. I can't get it to work with any DAW or digital audio workstation as a control surface. It has flying faders, motorized faders, so that you can mix music using your ears like you're supposed to without just staring at the screen. You can actually put your head down, put your hands on the faders, and mix the drums and the vocals and the guitars and the bass and everything by just using your ears like you're supposed to. But I can't get it to work. It's not functioning as it should. And I'm coming to the realization, and I think this, regardless of what I'm talking about here, I think a lot of listeners can kind of relate to this, that you've pushed your old gear to its limits. I've held on to this gear for over 10 years, and in many cases, well over 10 years. The Project Mix IO, that's 15 years old by now. The Tascam, that's at least 15 years old by now. That came out during Windows XP, and I'm trying to use it well into Windows 10. With all of Windows 10's driver issues and headaches, the Project Mix is using FireWire, for God's sake. When's the last time you used a FireWire anything in modern times? And it's going into a PCI FireWire card. PCI. Not PCI Express, not PCI Express 4, 8, or 16, anything like that. FireWire into a PCI slot. I'm painting the picture that I'm pushing my old gear to its limits. The last drivers available for all this stuff is from 2010, maybe 2012 at the latest. It might be time to start considering, I'm going to do this anyway, but selling some of that gear and updating a few things. I've put it off for almost 2 decades. And that's the moral of this story. I'm pushing this old stuff as far towards 2020 as I can in this technology from the turn of the century. So that's where I'm at. I have plenty of other audio interfaces I can use. I just really... I'm not getting rid of the 410D or the 4710D microphone preamp. That's going to be the crown jewel, the keystone of my entire recording studio. But what that mic pre runs into, the actual audio interface, probably it's time. It needs to have Type-C or Thunderbolt output. Get with the times, something within the last couple years old. I'm looking at a couple Tascams that accept ADAT input and Toslink. That's still in use today. That's how I'll get my mic pre to connect to it. But the writing is on the wall. What was the other thing? Oh, the most important, the most fun thing. If you don't care about how audio works or any of the recording studio headaches, you've made it this far into the podcast. Now I'm going to talk about something that's actually pretty neat. I have been unearthing some true treasures out of storage, not just my Zapper for the NES or my mini disc Walkman or my actual cassette Walkman or all sorts of manner of cable and old digital cameras and things like that, but something I've had in storage, something that I hadn't turned on in almost 10 years, was my arcade cabinet. On Craigslist 10 years ago, I found an old gutted Konami arcade cabinet, and I took the rest of the little guts out of it, put in a PC, basically turned it into a big PC case, and I turned it into a giant arcade machine that runs Steam. And so I've got Street Fighter 4, which is why I built it. I wanted a Street Fighter 4 cabinet, but I couldn't find one in Houston, even just to put quarters in. So I said, I'll just build my own. I'll put Steam on the thing and put Street Fighter 4, and then I'll have my Street Fighter 4 arcade cabinet. So anyways, I've pulled it out of storage. It's covered in dust. I have the PC guts. And all of this, by the way, you can see on Instagram. I put an album of 10 pictures up there of the actual arcade machine after I pulled it out of storage and fired it up. So Geek Therapy Radio on Instagram, you can see everything I'm talking about. So I plugged things back in. I kind of took out various wires that were hanging off that apparently went to nowhere. I forgot. Remember, I built this thing 10 years ago. So think back to where we were with computers and CPUs and everything. Basically, what this is running off is an old Core 2 Duo. Socket 775 Core 2 Duo. I think it's an E8500. Not even hyper-threading, just a dual core. And an NVIDIA GTS 250. Not a GTX. GTS 250. Remember back in the day when NVIDIA named things? It wasn't all GTX, it wasn't all RTX, it wasn't all GT. We had all sorts of nomenclatures, 8800 GS or whatever. Now, this is a NVIDIA GTS 250. And the reason why, now that I'm mentioning it, I remember why I scoured Craigslist for this particular card. Unless there's something come out in more modern times that has this feature, this was the only most modern card at the time that had an S-video output. that had analog video output in addition to HDMI and DVI and VGA and whatever. Did it even have HDMI? I don't recall if it has HDMI, but it definitely has DVI and VGA. But most importantly at the time for me was S-Video, because in the arcade machine at the time, I used that same tube CRT TV I'm talking about that I run my retro games. That used to be in the arcade machine, so that when I ran arcade games, they looked as close to replicating the actual arcade machine as possible. Because remember, when you're playing Street Fighter II Championship Edition, it wasn't on an LCD screen or LED screen. It was on a big, heavy glass CRT. So that's what I built into. I put brackets in there and straps and had the TV sitting in there, and I have the glass that goes over it to make it as authentic as possible, and it required that S-Video output from the video card. In its current state, the arcade machine is using, I believe it's a 27-inch LED monitor, and it fits in there perfectly, absolutely perfectly. There's so many parts about this project that felt almost ordained when I put it together. The way that these fasteners I put on there came together. I can't go into detail right now, but there's an LED light. The arcade joystick I use is called the X-Arcade Tank Stick, and it's a 2-player setup. So I have the bat. I've already modified it for fighting games. I have the circular gate bat on there for the joystick, and I have 8 Sanwa buttons. I replaced the buttons on my side with 8 Sanwa buttons. So you have the row of three, and then 2 below. So they're the round top Sanwa buttons. Because remember, like I said, I built this to play Street Fighter 4 mainly, in addition to have emulators like MAME and Nintendo and Sega and all that stuff on there. But really it's for fighting games is my original concept for modern fighting games, for Street Fighter 4. Whoever's standing to the right of me uses whatever built-in switches came with the tank stick, which are still really good stitches, but they're concave. There's a scoop out of the buttons, and I didn't prefer the feel of that. Most Street Fighter arcade machines that you'll find modern, like Street Fighter 4, are using the round top Sanwa switches, Sanwa buttons, and a bat for the joystick. Not the gumball, but a bat for the joystick. But that's completely up to players' taste. If you go to Evo or watch any sort of esports, Street Fighter tournament, fighting game tournament, those competitors have modified their fight sticks to their taste, to their feel. So they might use the gumball tops. I prefer the bat style. I prefer a circle gate because I'm more of a Shotokan player. That means I prefer players like Ryu and Ken and Goken and Akuma and Oni. Oni was my guy in Ultra Street Fighter 4. I got the best with Oni. But those all can benefit from a circular gate. Charge characters like Guile and Blanca and so forth, and Decapre benefit from square gates. Or I think a good blend for me is an octagonal gate, but I still prefer the circular. I still play charge characters with a circular gate. I just have the feel for it. That's just my preference, what I prefer. So you might be wondering, Johnny, how do you turn on the computer? Do you have like a computer case up there behind the marquee? No. Again, if you go to Geek Therapy Radio on Instagram, you can see what I've done here. This is pretty ghetto rigged, by the way, in its current state. I have that, remember, socket 775 Core 2 Duo motherboard sitting there with 4 gigs of DDR3 RAM, 2 gig sticks. I have it just basically sitting up there on the MDF wood, basically. I have a couple fans in the cabinet to move air around. But you're thinking, well, how do you switch it on? If there's no front I/O, there's no front panel connections, how do you turn the actual arcade machine on, to turn on the computer and everything? Well, here's what I did. I took the leads from the front panel connection. So those are things like the reset switch, the power switch, the the drive LEDs and stuff like that. All that is the front panel I/O. All I did was take the power switch, plugged it into the power switch header, and I took it and I took the wire and I split it into the two positive and negative of the that go to a switch that normally go to the power switch on the front of the PC case. I went to the hardware store and I got a momentary switch for, I don't know, 50 cents. It's just this red button that you attached those leads to, the two prongs of the momentary switch that trigger the PC to turn on through the front panel I/O. And it works like a charm. The other thing I could have done is just kind of touch the two wires together to trip the computer to turn on, but I thought I didn't want to be that ghetto. It would look much better. So underneath the joystick, again, you can see this on Geek Therapy Radio Instagram, I have that red momentary switch, and it feels so good to press. That's what turns on the entire system. Now, as far as power delivery, I have a power strip, a surge protector inside the arcade cabinet and an extension cord that runs outside the arcade cabinet. Depending on my mood, I do run an Ethernet cable in there to the motherboard, to its gigabit Ethernet connection. I do have 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. I might experiment with that. I'll test out the ping with that because I don't like having cables running all over the floor if I can avoid it. I could speak at length about this arcade cabinet, and I'm going to do a full YouTube video, a full tour of it, because hopefully it will inspire anybody else out there to endeavor such a project like that. It is the most rewarding thing I've ever built. Most rewarding project I've ever done. It's my favorite toy, because I know my wife is listening, and these are my toys. It's my favorite toy that I've ever tinkered with, that I ever built, that I ever put together. And I should comment on how it runs. I fired up Ultra Street Fighter 4 last night on the dual core, Core 2 Duo E8500, and the NVIDIA GTS 250 in the system with 4 gigabytes of RAM and running Windows 7, I believe it's 64-bit. I'm getting 200 frames a second, 1080p, everything maxed in Ultra Street Fighter 4. That's not too shabby. I was concerned that it might not have aged well over time. I have the latest NVIDIA drivers for it, which are from 2016. That's the last time they released a driver for the GTS 250. But it runs great. MAME runs great. So running all the old arcade games on there runs beautifully. The whole thing works so much better than I could have imagined. I was so worried having things just sit there and rot, but it runs perfectly. Dual core, 4 gigs of RAM, GTS 250. It runs Windows 7. Like I said, 4 gigs of RAM. I think I have a 128 gig solid state drive in there. It's awesome. Windows 7 is so good. Windows 7 was the best Windows of modern times. Some would argue Windows XP. It's a back and forth. We can all agree that Windows 7 is infinitely better than Windows 10 and is an absolute godsend from the train wreck that was Windows 8. Windows 7 was and still is so good. Like I mentioned, I only have 4 gigabytes of RAM in that dual core system, but it runs so snappy. There's so little overhead in Windows 7. It is so unbloated with nonsense and constant freaking updates downloading in the background. It runs so well with just those minimums. 4 gigs, dual core. GTS 250. It runs so well. Oh, the speakers, the audio, and I'll end with this. The audio system I have on it. I have this old pair of Dell 2.1 speakers. It's a little subwoofer with 2 freestanding speakers. I have them mounted above the glass of the arcade machine, out of the way. You really can't see them. They're not in the way of the screen. It sounds so good. It sounds really, really good. I have the subwoofer inside the cabinet, so the cabinet kind of booms and shakes when you do uppercuts and sound effects and play music through it. It sounds really good. I am so proud of this machine, and I can't wait to do a full YouTube video on it. But I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I have a treat, by the way, on the way out. You're going to want to tune in for this week's broadcast, The Big Show, that airs Saturday night in Houston, but the podcast drops of which on Friday. I've got a whole list of guests coming on to share their favorite retro tech or their favorite memories of retro tech. I have George Norrie from Coast to Coast AM. He's already sent me his recording. Clint from LGR, Lazy Game Reviews, has already sent me his favorite piece of retro tech recording. David Murray, the 8-Bit guy, has already sent me his recording. Oh, who else has sent me there? Oh, Colin from This Does Not Compute. He gave me 9 minutes on the mini disc player, which I so appreciate, because I emailed him that day that I found my mini disc player. Said, Colin, I found my freaking mini disc Walkman. I thought you'd appreciate it. And that gave me the idea for this whole show that I'm putting together here. So we'll see who else chimes in. I've sent it out to a few people. Austin Evans, we'll see if he chimes in. Marquez Brownlee, we'll see if... I doubt that he'll chime in here. James Rolfe, he may get at me. I've talked to him in the past. He may get at me, but we'll see if Austin or Marquez reaches out. But it's going to be a great show, super duper fun show that drops on Friday and airs on Saturday. So stick around for that. Tell your friends about Geek Therapy Radio if you like Geek Therapy Radio. But remember, we're all geeks about something. Embrace your inner geek. You are worthy of love. You're worthy of giving love. You are worthy of being loved. Just know you always have a home here, always at Geek Therapy Radio. And with that, see you guys tomorrow.
Geek Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.